You might think you know betrayal. You might think you understand what it's like to lose everything, but you don't. Not until the very people who carried you in their arms, who taught you your first words, turn around and orchestrate your complete financial ruin, all while looking you dead in the eyes with a chilling, vacant superiority, a look that says, "You deserved this. The property I built, the home my wife and I poured our entire lives into, the one piece of security I had in this world, is gone, stripped from me by my own mother and two brothers, leaving me not just homeless, but utterly hollowed out. A cautionary tale of what happens when you trust the blood that runs in your veins more than the contract signed on a dotted line." The question I've lived with, the one that keeps me up staring at a borrowed ceiling in a borrowed room, is this: was I wrong to hold my peace for so long, to believe that family loyalty would ultimately triumph over sheer, unadulterated greed? Tell me, honestly, would you have waited for a cry for help to be answered? Or would you have burned the whole rotten structure down the second you felt the first flicker of the fire they were building under you? I need to go back, way back, to before the rot set in, to the time when my family, my mother Eleanor, and my two older brothers, Michael and David, were just my family. We weren't rich, not by any stretch of the imagination, but we were comfortable, lower middle class, and everything we had was built on my father's back, a man who worked himself into an early grave as a construction foreman, a man whose only failing was perhaps a blind, unwavering belief in his wife and sons. My father passed when I was 20, a defining, shattering moment that left a gaping hole in our lives and, crucially, in our financial stability. He left behind a modest life insurance policy, enough to pay off the small mortgage on the house he'd built for my mother, the house they'd lived in since their wedding day, a small, two-bedroom bungalow that was the very heart of our existence. He also left a verbal decree, one he had reiterated hundreds of times, a philosophy: family first. Look out for your mother, boys, and help each other get a leg up. It was a beautiful sentiment, and one I took to heart with the earnest naivete of a grieving son. Michael and David, already in their late 20s and early 30s, were established, or so I thought. Michael had a decent-paying job at a logistics company, and David was working as an independent contractor, always promising to hit it big with his next roofing job. They were the big brothers, the ones who were supposed to guide me, the youngest, the one who was still struggling to figure out a career path. For the first few years, the three of us kept the promise, at least outwardly. We made sure Mom was okay, checking in, handling the small repairs the house needed. But then my life started to move forward in a way theirs didn't. I met Clara, my wife, the anchor that kept me tethered to sanity through all of this. She was and is everything good in my world. Kind, ridiculously smart, and the only person who ever saw the potential in me beyond the shadow of my deceased father. We got married young, and the question of housing immediately became the most pressing concern. That's when I had an idea, a big, ambitious, and ultimately disastrous idea. I had saved every penny I earned working multiple side jobs, and with Clara's modest savings, we had a decent chunk of cash. My father's bungalow was nice, but it was Mom's house, and with two grown brothers, there was no way it could ever be truly mine. So I approached my mother. There was a vacant, dilapidated piece of land next door, an oversized lot that had been sitting unused for decades, a true eyesore. I saw a future there. I pitched the idea to my mother. I would buy that vacant lot, an incredible investment for the future, and then, using my father's connections and the knowledge I had gained from him, I would finance and build a brand new, modern duplex on that land. One half of the duplex would be a new, beautiful, accessible home for my mother, connected by a small garden path to the other half, where Clara and I would live. This arrangement would keep us close, allow me to look after her every day, and be a lasting physical testament to the family first motto. My mother, Eleanor, was ecstatic. She cried, saying it was exactly what my father would have wanted, a real compound for the family. Michael and David, however, were lukewarm. Michael, ever the pragmatist with a touch of condescension, just grunted and said, "It's a huge financial risk, little brother, but if you want to play real estate developer, go for it. Just don't come crying to me when you lose it all." David was worse. He seemed subtly resentful, muttering about how I was always trying to one-up everyone. But they offered no help, no capital, and no labor. I was fine with that. Clara and I took out a hefty construction loan, and I threw myself into the project. I called in every favor my father had ever earned. I worked every single weekend, every evening after my day job, acting as the general contractor, the laborer, the cleaner, and the foreman. Clara managed the paperwork, the budget, and the endless stream of permits. It was 2 years of pure, grueling exhaustion, but the result was breathtaking. It was a beautiful, 2-unit, single-structure duplex, a massive upgrade from the old bungalow. The title to the entire property, the entire new structure, was put solely in my name, a fact that my mother and I discussed explicitly with the lawyer. The loan was solely in my name, the collateral was the new construction, and the whole point was that it was my investment, my liability, and my asset. The agreement, though, was cemented by love, not just legality. Mom would live in her half, rent-free, for the rest of her life, and I would be next door to care for her. The moment we moved in, everything changed. The new house, the property I had mortgaged my future for, became the new center of attention. Mom was happy, yes, but Michael and David saw the value immediately. The duplex was easily worth 4 times what the old bungalow was. Suddenly, they were around all the time, not just visiting Mom, but hanging around my side, admiring the fixtures, asking intrusive questions about the loan amount and the property value. Michael, the logistics manager, started making suggestions about how I should manage the property, implying I was too inexperienced to handle such a valuable asset. David, the contractor, started pointing out minor flaws in the building, never offering to help fix them, just criticizing my work. The air grew thick with a kind of simmering envy that was almost suffocating. My mother, unfortunately, was easily influenced. She started taking their side, believing their subtle hints that maybe the whole arrangement wasn't fair to her, or to them. "You've got all the legal papers, dear," she'd say, a new, wounded tone in her voice, "but it was your father's legacy that got you the good land, wasn't it? It should be family property." I tried to explain the massive debt, the work, the liability, but her ears were closed. The real crisis began 3 years after we moved in. David got himself into serious financial trouble. One of his contracting jobs went sideways, and he was facing bankruptcy and a lawsuit. He came to me first, desperate, asking for a loan that was frankly impossible for me to give. My mortgage payments were astronomical. I offered what I could, a small, non-interest loan that helped him cover an immediate court fee, but it wasn't enough to save him. That's when he went to my mother, and that's when Michael stepped in, acting as the mediator. The 3 of them had a meeting, a clandestine council of war that I was not privy to, but which I later learned the details of. They decided that the solution to David's problems and Michael's burgeoning jealousy was to seize the one truly valuable asset the family had, my property. They needed a huge chunk of cash, more than the sale of Mom's old bungalow would ever bring. The new duplex, however, was a goldmine. Their plan, as cold and calculating as anything you could read in a fictional thriller, was to force me to sell the duplex, pay off my loan, and then split the massive profit 3 ways. A third for David to save his skin, a third for Michael's troubles, which were non-existent, and a third for Mom to secure her future. As for me and Clara, we could, in Michael's words, go back to renting like everyone else. They started with psychological warfare. The constant pressure, the quiet accusations of selfishness, the daily, family meetings where I was the only person on the defensive. My mother would cry, telling me I was letting her favorite son go to ruin, that I was failing my father's memory. "He told you to help your brothers, didn't he? This is your chance," she sobbed. Michael presented me with a printed-out, formal-looking document, which was essentially a heavily worded threat of a lawsuit, alleging I had somehow coerced my mother into signing over her rightful claim to the adjacent land, a claim that was completely baseless. I dug in my heels. I stood my ground. The property was legally, unequivocally mine, secured by the mortgage I alone was paying. I told them no. I told them I was happy to help David with a job, with references with smaller sums, but I would not dismantle my family's future to bail him out of a hole he dug himself. That's when my mother played the ultimate card, the sentimental, heart-wrenching emotional blackmail that cut me to the bone. She packed a small bag and announced she was leaving, going to stay with Michael, because she simply couldn't bear to be next to me, the son who had abandoned his family. The garden path between our homes, the symbol of my devotion, was suddenly a chasm. This brings me to the absolute lowest point, the moment of pure shock that is still a blur of paperwork and betrayal. They couldn't force a sale, they knew that, but they didn't need to. Remember that old bungalow, my parents' original home? It was sitting on its own separate, adjacent lot. The duplex I built was on the vacant lot I bought. But here's the kicker. When my father paid off the bungalow's mortgage, the legal paperwork regarding the exact property lines for the two side-by-side parcels of land was incredibly old and ambiguous, something the lawyers warned me about when I purchased the empty lot. I had paid a surveyor and ensured my duplex was entirely on my new, clearly defined lot. But David and Michael, seeing their chance, leveraged that ambiguity. David, using his contractor know-how, and Michael, using his corporate knowledge, somehow, and I still don't know the full details, convinced my mother to sign a new deed resurveying the lines of her old, debt-free bungalow property. And here's the stomach-churning part. They drew the new line to encompass a tiny, almost imperceptible sliver of my driveway and a portion of my foundation, claiming that the original fence line had been the true boundary and that my new structure was, in effect, encroaching on her property. Because her property was mortgage-free and mine was deeply leveraged, the legal leverage was theirs. They weren't just trying to get money. They were trying to inflict maximum pain. I was served with the papers at my office, a formal notice of boundary encroachment, demanding I cease and desist using their property and threatening a full, devastating lawsuit that would freeze the property in litigation for years. My mother, my own mother, was the primary plaintiff. The shock was physical. I felt the blood drain from my face. Clara was beside herself. We spent every last cent of our emergency savings on legal fees, fighting tooth and nail against a phantom boundary line drawn with malice. The legal process was a slow-motion car crash. My lawyer was excellent, but their lawyer, paid for by the pooled resources of my two brothers and mother's small savings, was relentless and specialized in these kinds of nasty property disputes. Every mediation session was a horrific display of my family's toxic performance. Michael and David played the concerned, wronged sons, protecting their fragile, elderly mother from her greedy, youngest child. My mother, in one particularly gut-wrenching moment, looked at me, completely vacant of any love, and said, "Your father wanted us to be a family, not for you to build your own kingdom on top of our graves." I was utterly defeated, not by the legal facts, which were tenuous at best, but by the emotional, relentless pressure of fighting my own blood. My life was becoming a legal folder, every waking moment consumed by the betrayal, the fear of losing everything. So that's the situation I was in, facing ruin, my life savings evaporating in a legal war against my own mother and brothers, who were clearly and unequivocally attempting to steal the most valuable thing I owned, the house I built with my own hands, under the guise of family justice. They had moved beyond a simple request for help to an all-out siege, weaponizing my own mother's sentimental attachment to her old property and their shared capacity for avarice. The debt on my magnificent duplex was still crushing, but the asset was tied up in a lawsuit that could take years to resolve, financially suffocating me and Clara in the process. I was trapped, with the walls closing in, staring down a future where I would either bankrupt myself fighting them or capitulate and hand over a massive chunk of the property's value. Before I tell you what happened next, the decision I made that finally brought this agonizing chapter to a close, the decision that some might call brilliant and others might call equally ruthless, I want you to pause and comment below. What would you have done in my shoes? Would you have kept fighting the legal battle? Or would you have sought a final, definitive way out, even if it meant sacrificing the house you loved? Asterisk, asterisk, I need to know, because at that moment, I felt completely alone in the world, wrestling with the morality of a desperate man. I decided I couldn't fight them in court anymore, not because I was wrong, but because they had all the time and emotional blackmail in the world, and I had a life, a marriage, and a massive loan to worry about. I needed a clean, definitive end, a surgical strike that would give me back my life, even if the wound was deep. The moment of clarity came when my lawyer pointed out that the lawsuit, while baseless, had effectively frozen the sale of my entire property. It didn't matter who was right. No one would buy a house with active litigation and a boundary dispute. They had locked me out of my own equity. But then he mentioned something else, a detail that was the key to my escape. Because my mortgage was still enormous, and because the property was technically under a cloud of litigation, its sale value, to anyone but the bank, was zero. The bank, however, was in a different position. The moment the loan went into default, the bank would take over the property, and banks are notorious for not caring about petty family squabbles. They only care about clearing the debt. They would simply foreclose and sell the property at auction to the highest bidder to recoup their losses. They would not pursue my mother and brother's frivolous claim. It was a terrible, terrifying idea, but it was my only weapon. I made the conscious, agonizing decision to walk away from my home and deliberately allow the mortgage to default. The day I realized what I had to do, I walked through every room of that beautiful duplex, running my hands over the walls, the tile, the trim I had installed. I felt the sweat, the ache, the love, and the betrayal all at once. I told Clara, and her face, usually so strong, crumpled. It was the hardest conversation of our lives, acknowledging that the future we had built was an illusion, a magnificent cage built by my own kindness. But she saw the cold logic in it. We packed only the necessities, the things we couldn't live without, and quietly, under the cover of a rainy night, we moved out. We found a small, cheap rental 2 towns over. I stopped paying the mortgage. The letter started immediately, polite at first, then firm, then threatening. I ignored them all, focusing on my job and on Clara. 3 months later, the final foreclosure notice was delivered. The bank had seized the property. This was the climax, the moment I had been working toward, the ultimate, painful rejection of my family's greed. My mother and brothers, confident in their impending legal victory, had no idea I had simply handed the keys over to a force far more powerful than their spite, a multinational banking corporation. The bank, as predicted, immediately dismissed my mother's boundary suit as frivolous and without merit, and began the process of preparing the duplex for auction. Michael and David were blindsided. Their grand plan to seize the property's equity and divide it up had been completely nullified. Not only was the property no longer mine, but it wasn't theirs either. It was the bank's problem now. They couldn't sue the bank for a boundary line that encompassed a tiny piece of the driveway. The bank would simply crush them. They panicked. The calls started then, the frantic, angry, and finally, pleading calls. David called first, screaming that I had destroyed the family, that I had ruined his only chance to save himself. I simply told him, my voice flat and completely devoid of emotion, that I had merely removed the asset they were trying to steal from the equation. Michael called, attempting to be the slick negotiator, saying we could work something out, that I should reverse the foreclosure somehow. I hung up on him mid-sentence. But it was my mother's call that night that truly broke me, not with sadness, but with a cold, clear finality. She wasn't pleading, she was raging. How could you do this to me? Where am I supposed to live now? That was my house, right next to my old house. I reminded her that her old bungalow was safe, it was paid off, and she was welcome to move back into it, just as she had been before she moved into my brand new, free, rent-free unit. The duplex, however, was no longer either of ours. The best part? Because I allowed the bank to foreclose, the massive debt was settled through the sale of the house at auction. My credit took a nuclear hit, a consequence I accepted, but I was debt-free, and most importantly, they got absolutely nothing. Not a single, solitary cent of the profit they had so ruthlessly planned to divide. The aftermath was exactly what I deserved, a clean slate, financially, but a scorched earth, relationally. My mother and brothers were left to stew in their own bitterness. Mom moved back into her tiny, old bungalow, now sitting right next to a massive, imposing, and completely unattainable duplex that was eventually bought by a young couple who couldn't care less about the family drama next door. My brothers? They were forced to deal with David's financial woes on their own, and the last I heard, Michael was still trying to negotiate with the bank, a comical, futile effort. I never spoke to any of them again. Clara and I are doing okay. We're in a small apartment, rebuilding our savings piece by piece, and my credit score is slowly, painfully crawling back to life. But we are happy. We have our peace, our privacy, and a quiet understanding that our little unit of two is the only family we truly need. The property, the house I built, is gone, but so is the soul-crushing burden of their betrayal. I lost a house, but I gained my freedom, and that, I'm slowly realizing, is a trade-off I would make 1,000 times over. The moral of this story is a harsh one, a truth learned in the fiery crucible of betrayal. Some people will never love you as much as they love what you can give them. When it comes to family, the rules of business, the rules of law, must always supersede the rules of blood, because blood, when it runs cold, is the most corrosive thing in the world. I held on to a naive ideal of familial loyalty long after it was clear my trust was a weakness to be exploited, and it nearly cost me everything. My cry for help was answered, not by my family, but by my own ruthless self-preservation. Like this video if you were on my side, if you think my decision to walk away was the ultimate, necessary revenge. Subscribe for more stories like this. True tales of unimaginable betrayal and the tough choices people have to make to survive them. And please, share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comment section. Did I go too far? Or did I simply do what was necessary to protect myself and my wife? I'll see you all in the next story.